When I noticed him standing behind me in the hallway mirror, holding the folded piece of paper I had hidden between the pages of my old cookbook, my breath caught in my throat. Not because I was afraid of what was written there, I knew exactly what it said, but because I had forgotten it even existed. I had written it weeks ago in a moment of emotional chaos, then immediately regretted it, unable to bring myself to tear it up. And now, somehow, it had found its way into his hands. My husband was silent. His eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, he stared at the paper like it was something fragile and cursed at once. I wanted to speak, to explain, to say that it was all just a moment of weakness, but even I didn't know if that was true. His lips parted, but no words came. He read again, slower this time. Each line seemed to weigh heavier than the last. I felt the room spin slightly, like the walls were folding in around me. I gripped the edge of the counter just to stay upright. This was the moment everything could unravel. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the note wasn't even the worst of it. That behind those words were memories. And behind the memories was something I never thought I'd confess to anyone. My husband looked up, finally, his face blank with disbelief. And I knew, I had to tell the story from the beginning. Before the moment in the hallway. Before the note. Before I crossed the line with someone I should have never looked at that way. Let me explain how it all started. And while I take a breath to gather the strength to share the truth, tell me in the comments, have you ever come dangerously close to a line you swore you'd never cross? What stopped you, or didn't? I never imagined anything would happen between us. That's the truth, no matter how it looks now, no matter what conclusions others might draw from the wreckage. I was 53, married for over 25 years, and, on the surface, everything looked fine. Comfortable even. The kind of quiet life people envy from a distance. But if you peeled back the curtain just a little, you'd see what I saw every morning in the mirror, a version of myself slowly fading into the walls of a house that no longer knew how to speak. My husband and I weren't in a bad place, not in the dramatic sense. There were no screaming matches, no betrayals, no bruises or slammed doors. But there also weren't lingering glances across the dinner table, or casual touches just because. Affection had given way to function. Our lives moved in quiet parallel lines, intersecting mostly through reminders about errands or updates about our adult son. The day he called to ask if his best friend could stay with us for a while, I didn't hesitate. His friend had just broken up with a longtime girlfriend and lost the lease on their shared apartment. He was still finishing his final term at university, and housing near campus was tight. We had the space. Of course we could help. He arrived that Thursday afternoon with just 2 duffel bags, a backpack, and a tired smile. 25, tall, easy with his words in a way that never came across as forced. He hugged me when he came in. Not the brief, awkward kind that young people sometimes give to older adults, but a full-bodied embrace like I mattered in the room. It caught me off guard, and I scolded myself for the way my skin reacted to the warmth of it. From the beginning, he was helpful. He offered to take on repairs around the house my husband had been putting off for months, the loose stair rail, the dripping kitchen faucet, even the crooked photo frames in the hallway. He made it feel like his presence was meant to lift some invisible weight off my shoulders. At first, I chalked up my awareness of him to nothing more than the disruption of routine. Of course I'd notice a new person in the house. Of course I'd be more self-conscious about what robe I wore in the morning, or whether my hair looked as wild as it felt after a night of poor sleep. But it didn't stay that simple for long. I caught myself listening for his footsteps. I started looking for excuses to linger in the kitchen longer when I knew he'd be coming down. He always said good morning like he meant it. Always asked about my day and waited for the answer. One afternoon, he complimented my cooking. "You make it feel like home in here," he said, wiping his plate clean. That sentence replayed in my mind all night like a song I couldn't turn off. I told myself it was just flattery. Just his way of being polite. But something inside me began to shift. It wasn't about wanting him, not then. It was about remembering what it felt like to be noticed. To be looked at like someone worth lingering over. Still, I kept my distance. I folded his laundry, left it on the bench outside his room without knocking. I baked extra banana bread and told myself it was for the household. I sat with him on the back porch once while the sun was going down, and we talked about everything and nothing, music, books, the awkwardness of growing up. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. Not because the joke was clever, but because someone cared to share it with me. I could feel the line between us becoming thinner, even if we hadn't said or done anything that would raise suspicion. It was in the way he lingered in the kitchen after dinner. In how he leaned just slightly closer when he talked to me. How he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. And how, shamefully, I started watching him back. One morning, I passed by the guest bathroom as he was brushing his teeth. The door was slightly ajar. He was shirtless, hair damp from the shower, humming to himself. I kept walking. But my heartbeat quickened like I'd sprinted. Later that day, I sat alone in the living room while the laundry buzzed in the other room. I thought about my husband and how distant he'd been lately, always tired, always half listening. I thought about how long it had been since we'd touched in a way that wasn't logistical. And I thought about the man in the guest room, barely more than a boy, yet somehow more present in this house than the one I married. Guilt pressed hard against my chest, but it wasn't heavier than the emptiness I'd been carrying for years. I didn't act on anything. Not yet. I told myself I was still in control. That awareness wasn't action. That curiosity wasn't crime. But I knew. Deep down, I knew the trajectory was changing. And I was no longer sure I wanted to stop it. The next day, he asked me if I needed help fixing the broken drawer in the hallway cabinet. I told him no. But I didn't mean it. The drawer stayed broken. That's what I remember most vividly about the day that changed everything. It sat half open in the hallway, the track still loose, its jagged edge jutting out like a quiet reminder of something unfinished. I passed by it 3 times that morning, each time telling myself I would finally fix it. Or ask him to fix it. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was something strangely symbolic about it, this broken drawer that no one really noticed except me. A small imperfection in the otherwise neat, controlled rhythm of the house. I think that's how I was starting to see myself. Just another drawer, outwardly functional, but with something off inside. Something rattling loose. He was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, barefoot, wearing a gray t-shirt that clung to his back slightly from the warmth. The sunlight came in through the window, streaking across the countertops, catching the edges of his silhouette. He was humming again, he always hummed. It was never anything I recognized. Just quiet sounds that filled up the silence like he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I lingered at the bottom of the stairs for a moment longer than necessary, pretending to check my phone. Watching him. Studying the way he moved with ease through the space. How natural he'd become in our home. "Morning," he said, turning his head slightly but not all the way. I cleared my throat. "Good morning." He poured a second cup of coffee without asking and slid it across the counter toward me. I took it wordlessly, the warmth of the mug settling into my hands like an anchor. The silence between us was no longer awkward, it had transformed into something charged. It buzzed faintly, like the static before a storm. We sat in the kitchen, sipping our coffee, both facing the window as if the weather could somehow fill in the blank spaces we were avoiding. I tried to focus on the outside, the garden, the fence that needed repainting, the overgrown ivy curling up the trellis. But my attention kept drifting back to the man beside me. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You always wake up before everyone else." I hesitated before answering. "Habit. I like the quiet." He nodded slowly. "I do too." The conversation was nothing. And yet it wasn't. Because there was a layer beneath it that neither of us named. That shared look, the hesitation between words, the too long pause before one of us responded. These weren't accidents. They were the slow, deliberate beats of something beginning. I should have walked away. I should have taken my coffee and gone to the porch, or up to my bedroom, or into the laundry room to finally fold those clothes I'd been ignoring. But I didn't. I sat there, the mug warming my palms, while my chest tightened with something I didn't want to define. He set his cup down gently and stood. "I'm going to take a quick shower." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He walked past me, and as he did, his hand brushed lightly against my shoulder, so faint it could have been unintentional. But it wasn't. I knew it. He knew I knew it. When I heard the water turn on upstairs, I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at the broken drawer again. I opened it. Closed it. Tried again. It stuck the same way it always did. I tugged it harder, angry at myself, at the tension building in my chest, at the way a part of me was hoping he'd fix it later, just so I could watch his hands. My husband was away for the weekend visiting his sister. He'd left early the morning before, kissing my forehead like he always did, already mentally checked out. We hadn't spoken since. I hadn't texted. Neither had he. When I heard footsteps again, I turned quickly, pretending to straighten a photo frame on the wall. He was coming down the stairs, towel in one hand, hair damp. He stopped halfway, leaning on the railing, watching me. "Do you want help with that drawer?" he asked. I looked at him too long. "No, it's fine." He raised an eyebrow, almost smiling. "You've passed it 3 times today." I shrugged. "I've learned to live with it. Maybe it doesn't have to stay broken." The words hung between us like dust in the sunlight. I didn't answer. I walked past him instead, toward the living room, setting my coffee down on the side table. I sat on the sofa, pulled a blanket over my knees, not because I was cold, but because I needed something to hold. A few moments later, he walked in, slower this time. He didn't sit right away. He just stood across the room, silent. Observing. His eyes were darker in the morning light, and he wasn't smiling now. The tension had shifted into something heavier. He took a step closer. I didn't move. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still. He sat beside me, close enough that I felt the warmth of him, but not touching. I couldn't look at him. I stared ahead, pretending I was watching the window again, but all I saw was the reflection of his shoulder next to mine. "I've been trying to ignore this," he said softly. I swallowed. My voice was almost a whisper. "Me too." We didn't say anything after that. We didn't need to. The words had already pushed open a door we couldn't close again. He turned his head slightly. I did the same. For a moment, there was only the sound of our breathing. And then, without warning, without ceremony, we kissed. It lasted a second. Maybe 2. Not long enough to feel real, but long enough to make everything else afterward impossible to pretend. When we pulled back, we didn't speak. I stood, walked out of the room without looking back. My legs were unsteady, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. Upstairs, I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted slightly, her cheeks flushed. She looked like someone who had just opened a door she wasn't supposed to. And she had. I had. There was no going back. Later that afternoon, I tried to act normal. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, called my husband and asked about his sister. He told me everything was fine. He asked how the house was. I told him everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. The drawer in the hallway was still broken. And so was I. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the streetlight outside shifting slowly across the room. My husband had texted before bed, telling me he'd be back Sunday night instead of Monday. I replied with a simple okay, but my fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, unsure if I should say more. I didn't. I couldn't. My head was a blur of noise, but my body remained still, like it was trying to avoid detection. The kiss had changed something fundamental, even if it was brief. Even if no one saw it. Even if we both walked away from it pretending we could act like it didn't happen. But it did happen. And my world had quietly shifted on its axis. The next morning, I avoided the kitchen. I waited until I heard him leave the house before coming downstairs. I busied myself with the vacuum, wiping windows, organizing drawers that hadn't been touched in years. Anything to avoid thinking. But every time I passed the hallway, I saw the broken drawer, still stuck, still crooked, still mocking me with its imperfection. He didn't return until late afternoon. I heard the front door open and close while I was folding towels in the laundry room. My heart rate picked up, my hands trembling just enough to make me refold the same towel 3 times. I waited for footsteps. I waited for something, anything, but the house remained quiet. When I finally emerged, I found him sitting on the back porch, legs stretched out in front of him, a book resting unopened in his lap. He didn't look at me when I slid the door open and stepped outside. I stood behind him, unsure of what to say, how to act, what version of myself I was supposed to inhabit now. After a moment, he glanced back, then looked forward again. "It's nice out." I nodded. "Yes. It is." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't tense either. It was something else, an undefined space that neither of us dared fill with words. I wanted to ask him if he regretted it. I wanted him to say it meant nothing. Or everything. Anything. But I couldn't bring myself to ask. I walked past him to the edge of the porch and sat on the top step. The garden was overgrown. The hydrangeas I'd once cared for now sagged under their own weight. The grass needed trimming. It all felt like a reflection of me, neglected, heavy, too far gone to fix in one afternoon. He finally spoke again. "I think I'm going to head to the library later. Get out for a bit." I nodded again. "That's probably a good idea." We didn't say goodbye. He slipped inside, and a few minutes later I heard the front door close again. I sat on the porch until the sun began to dip below the trees. The air grew cooler, and I wrapped my arms around myself, not for warmth, but to feel the pressure of something, anything, grounding me. My thoughts were no longer quiet. They roared inside me, pulling in all directions. What did I want? What was I doing? Was I already too far down a road I couldn't walk back from? When the sun was gone completely, I went inside and turned on the hallway light. I stood in front of the drawer again. I didn't try to fix it this time. I simply stared at it for a long while, then finally reached down, pulled it open halfway, and forced it shut. It jammed, like always. I left it that way. The next morning, my husband called. He asked how everything was. I told him things were fine. I asked about his sister, and he launched into a story about her neighbor's barking dog. I tried to laugh where appropriate. I said I missed him. It wasn't a lie, exactly. I missed who we used to be. I missed the simplicity of routine before the ache inside me grew too loud to ignore. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the coffee pot, the sink, the sunlight hitting the tiles in a familiar pattern. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine waking up tomorrow with everything back to the way it had been. But even in my imagination, the memory of the kiss intruded. He came back around noon. I was in the backyard trimming the ivy that had overtaken the fence. I heard the gate creak and turned to see him standing there, grocery bag in hand. He offered a small smile. Thought I'd make dinner tonight. I blinked, surprised. You cook? He shrugged. Enough not to poison us. I didn't know how to respond. I just nodded and stepped aside to let him through. The rest of the day passed in a strange limbo. He cooked. I chopped vegetables. We moved around the kitchen like coworkers, polite and efficient. We didn't talk about anything real. And yet every brush of an elbow, every reach across the counter, felt weighted with memory. Dinner was quiet. The food was surprisingly good. We ate in the dining room, across from one another. No music, no television. Just the clink of forks against plates. At one point, I looked up and caught him watching me. Neither of us looked away right away. Afterward, I thanked him for the meal. He nodded. I went upstairs to take a shower. The water was too hot, but I didn't adjust it. I let the sting run over my skin, hoping it would silence the restless thrum under my ribs. That night, I didn't lie awake. I slept, finally, but the dreams were strange and filled with unfinished conversations and half-open doors. The next day was Sunday. My husband would be home that evening. I spent the morning cleaning, compulsively. I scrubbed the countertops, changed the sheets, vacuumed places no one would look. He helped. We didn't speak much, but we moved together through the house in a quiet rhythm. In the early afternoon, I went to the hallway, opened the broken drawer, and took everything out. I flipped it upside down, inspected the track, found the misaligned screw. With a screwdriver, I adjusted it, tested the slide. It opened smoothly. He came up behind me and looked down at the drawer. You fixed it. I nodded. It wasn't as hard as I thought. He didn't say anything else. Just stood there, quiet. Then he stepped away. Later, when my husband arrived, I greeted him at the door with a hug. He kissed my cheek and asked how the weekend had been. I told him it was good. I told him the drawer was finally fixed. He looked confused, then smiled. Well, that's something, he said. Yes, I thought. It was something. But not the thing that mattered most. Not anymore. There was something oddly comforting about slipping back into the routine of 3. Breakfasts returned to their quiet pace, the hum of everyday noise filling the background like a familiar lullaby. My husband sat across from me at the kitchen table, reading the news on his tablet, occasionally commenting on headlines I wasn't truly listening to. I nodded, responded when necessary, all while pretending I hadn't noticed the way the young man glanced at me from the sink as he rinsed his dishes. It was strange how quickly things could seem normal again when everyone agreed to pretend. But I felt it in every breath I took. The heaviness. The fragility of the balance I was walking on. And worst of all, the growing awareness that he hadn't forgotten either. I watched them together, my husband and him, laughing over shared jokes, passing tools back and forth as they repaired a piece of molding near the front door. Their ease around each other only deepened the divide within me. My husband liked him, trusted him. And I had allowed something to take root that threatened all of it. That afternoon, I found myself reorganizing the pantry. I wasn't sure why. It didn't need it. But I needed something mindless, something tactile. As I shifted jars and spices, I heard footsteps behind me. "You missed one," he said. I turned. He was holding a tin of baking powder, a slight smirk on his face. "Put it on the shelf," I murmured, not meeting his eyes. He stepped closer than he needed to, placing it beside the others. I moved aside, but not enough. Our arms brushed. I pulled away quickly, too quickly. "Sorry," he said, and his voice was low, steady. I didn't respond. I closed the cabinet and walked past him, my pulse racing in my throat. He didn't follow, but I could feel the heat of his gaze against my back. Later that evening, we all had dinner together. I had made roasted chicken, my husband's favorite. He complimented the crispiness, and I smiled, grateful for something simple to cling to. Across the table, the young man said nothing for a while, then asked a question about the recipe. I answered without looking at him. After the meal, while my husband loaded the dishwasher, I stood in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed tightly. He joined me, standing beside me in silence as we watched my husband move methodically, as he always did. I didn't speak. Neither did he. But I knew we were both thinking the same thing, how fragile this was, how one wrong word or glance could shatter everything. The next morning, I woke early. The house was still. I wandered into the living room and opened the curtains. Outside, a fog had settled over the yard. Everything looked softer, blurred around the edges. I stood there for a long time, cup of coffee in hand, trying to remember what it felt like to not carry a secret. When I turned around, he was there. Standing at the edge of the room, hair uncombed, still in a t-shirt and joggers. Our eyes met, and neither of us looked away. He said nothing. Just nodded once, slowly, like we had acknowledged something unspoken and agreed not to say it aloud. The tension didn't go away. It evolved. It began to seep into small moments, shared silences, the brushing of hands as we passed each other, the quick glances when no one else was watching. It wasn't physical anymore. It was psychological. A tether between us neither of us dared cut. One afternoon, my husband asked me if I wanted to drive out to the lake house that weekend. We hadn't been in months, and he said it needed airing out before the weather turned. I agreed, welcoming the change in scenery. But then he added that he might not be able to come. A work meeting was rescheduled, and if it wasn't cancelled by Friday, he'd send me and our guest ahead to start the cleaning. I nodded slowly, heart pounding. "We'll see what happens," I said lightly, but the implication lingered between us all week. That night, as I stood brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't look different. I still wore the same robe, used the same lavender soap, twisted my hair into the same loose bun. But I felt different. Like I'd stepped out of my own skin and was watching myself from a distance. On Friday afternoon, my husband confirmed he wouldn't be joining us until the following day. He gave me a list of small tasks to check off at the lake house, then kissed my cheek and said, "You'll be fine." I smiled. I packed a small bag. I told myself it would be ordinary. Uneventful. He loaded the car before I could say much. The young man had already placed his bag in the back seat. As we pulled out of the driveway, I glanced at the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror and felt something shift in my chest, a dread I didn't know how to name yet. The drive was mostly quiet. We made small talk about traffic, the weather, a podcast he half listened to. I focused on the road, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. At one point, he adjusted the air vent and his arm grazed mine. I flinched, but not from surprise. From recognition. When we arrived, the house smelled musty from disuse. I opened the windows, let the breeze in. He brought in the bags without being asked. Everything felt functional. Mechanical. We began cleaning, dusting, airing out linens. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us was no longer empty. After dinner, a simple meal of sandwiches and tea, we sat on the porch. The lake glistened in the fading light. Crickets chirped in the background. He handed me a blanket without a word. I took it, grateful, unsure whether it was for the cold or the nerves threading through my limbs. He didn't sit next to me. He stood by the railing, staring out at the water. I studied his posture, the quiet stillness in his frame. I wondered what he was thinking. I wondered if he could hear the drumbeat in my chest. When he finally turned around, he looked different. Not in his face, but in his presence. Calmer. Older, somehow. He didn't move toward me. He just held my gaze and said, "I'm not going to do anything you don't want." The sentence hit me like a stone skipping across still water. Not because of the words, but because of the choice they forced me to acknowledge. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He nodded once, then went inside, leaving me alone with the sound of the wind and the growing night. I sat there long after the sun disappeared, unsure whether I was waiting for him to return or for myself to make a decision. But the decision, I realized, had already been made. The moment we got in that car, maybe even long before. I stood, wrapped the blanket tighter around me, and stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet click. The night at the lake house was quiet in a way that made every sound feel louder than it was. The creak of floorboards beneath my bare feet, the soft rustle of wind through the trees outside, even the occasional hum of the refrigerator, it all echoed in my ears like reminders that I was no longer home, at least not in the way that word used to mean something certain. I moved through the house slowly, unsure of where I should be, unsure of what I was avoiding. The blanket still hung around my shoulders, and though I wasn't cold anymore, I clutched it tightly, like armor. I paused in the hallway, the guest room to my left, the master bedroom straight ahead. The air felt still. I listened for footsteps, the creak of a door, anything that might make this feel like a shared space, but all I heard was silence. I entered the bedroom without turning on the light. The moonlight through the window cast soft shadows across the floor. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the blanket slip down to my lap. My hands were folded, restless, picking at the edge of my sleeve like it would help me think. I didn't know what I was doing. That's the truth. I could tell myself I was still in control, still deciding, still tethered to some version of who I used to be. But somewhere deep down, I think I knew the decision had already been made, not with logic, not with careful thought, but with a slow erosion of boundaries that had started long before this trip. When the knock came, I didn't move. It was soft, not tentative but not bold either. I didn't speak, didn't say yes or no. The door creaked slightly, just a few inches. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. I felt it in my chest before I saw his silhouette. He stepped in slowly, saying nothing. There was no urgency in his movements. He closed the door quietly behind him, as though he understood that any sound might break whatever spell we were under. I watched him approach, heart beating in a rhythm I could feel all the way up my neck. He stopped a few feet away. We looked at each other for a long time. No words. None were needed. There was nothing to justify, nothing to explain. Not now. We kissed. It was soft, slow, with a kind of finality that didn't feel like an ending but the acceptance of a moment we'd both been approaching for far too long. The kiss didn't ask for anything more. It didn't demand. It simply existed, and that made it more powerful than anything else. He stepped back after a moment, his eyes never leaving mine. Then, without speaking, he turned and left the room, closing the door behind him with the same quiet care. I sat there, unmoving, my body frozen in that thin space between adrenaline and guilt. My lips still tingled from the contact, but it wasn't just the kiss that lingered. It was what it meant. What it had taken from me. What it had revealed. I lay down on the bed without undressing, pulling the blanket up to my chin. I stared at the ceiling, at the pale glow from the moon filtering through the curtains. I didn't sleep. Not really. My body rested, but my mind stayed awake, retracing steps, rethinking words, remembering the look in his eyes when he stepped away. In the morning, the lake was covered in a layer of mist. I stood at the edge of the dock with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, my feet bare against the dew-covered boards. The house behind me was silent. I didn't know if he was awake. I didn't know if he would speak to me. I didn't know what I would say if he did. I watched the mist shift, dissolve with the rising sun. It reminded me of the distance between right and wrong, how blurry it had become. How easy it was to stand in the fog and convince yourself you were still on solid ground. We drove home in silence. The road stretched long before us, but I couldn't have told you what towns we passed, what music played on the radio, what signs we ignored. My thoughts were too loud, drowning out everything else. When we arrived, my husband was already home. He greeted us in the driveway, cheerful, asking how the house had held up. I answered with simple words, vague assurances, hiding the weight I'd brought back with me beneath polite smiles. Inside, I unpacked slowly, folding clothes that still carried the scent of the lake air. I placed them neatly into drawers, one by one, hands moving as though they belonged to someone else. When I reached the bottom of the bag, I found the sweater I'd worn on the porch. I held it up to my face and breathed in, the scent of wood smoke and wind pulling me back to a moment I couldn't take back. That evening, my husband poured me a glass of wine and talked about his sister's recovery from surgery, the strange casserole her neighbor had brought over, the way the dog barked at every passing car. I nodded at the right times. I smiled. I laughed once, even, though it felt strange in my mouth. He reached for my hand across the table. I let him hold it. When I looked into his eyes, I saw someone who still believed I was the same woman who had kissed him goodbye 4 days earlier. The woman who folded his shirts just right, who knew how he liked his coffee, who never missed a dental appointment or forgot to buy his favorite toothpaste. And maybe I was still that woman. Maybe I wasn't. That night, as we lay in bed side by side, I listened to his breathing slow and deepen. He was asleep within minutes. I turned on my side, facing away from him, my eyes open in the dark. I thought about the drawer in the hallway, the one I had finally fixed. It no longer stuck. It opened and closed with ease. But now, every time I passed it, I couldn't help but think of all the days I had lived with it broken. Of how long I had told myself it wasn't worth the trouble. It was fixed now. But something else wasn't. Something inside me had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. And there was no drawer for that. No screwdriver. No instruction manual. Only silence. And memory. And the slow realization that nothing was going to be simple again. There's a particular tension that arises when something you never intended to happen becomes part of your daily life. It's not sharp or sudden. It's quiet, a background hum that grows louder only in still moments, like when the house is empty, or the dishwasher hums late at night, or a familiar voice says your name and you hesitate before responding. That's how the days felt after we returned from the lake house. Nothing explosive. No reckoning. Just a slow, persistent weight pressing down on everything. He kept his distance. At first, I thought it was guilt. Or caution. But over time, I began to suspect it was something else, something harder to define. It wasn't avoidance. He was still there, still present in the same rooms, still polite, still helpful. But the closeness we had allowed to bloom between us had wilted into a careful neutrality, like two people walking side by side but never turning their heads. I found myself watching him more now that he wasn't watching me. The shift in his behavior made me more aware of every silence, every pause between words. He would speak with my husband like nothing had changed, would ask about sports or home repairs or weekend plans with an ease that made my skin crawl. Not because he was lying, he wasn't, but because I was. There were moments when I caught him glancing at me from across the room, but he always looked away quickly. No lingering looks. No quiet words. And somehow, that made it worse. The absence of acknowledgement became its own form of punishment. One morning, I walked into the living room to find the two of them talking about a project in the garage. My husband was animated, gesturing toward the back door, explaining something I didn't catch. The young man stood with his arms crossed, nodding along. I paused at the doorway for a second too long, and they both turned. "Want to help us sort the tools?" my husband asked, smiling. I hesitated. "No, I've got some things to finish inside." "Suit yourself," he said, already turning back toward the door. I felt his gaze linger for half a second longer than it should have. It wasn't invitation or regret. It was something colder. Closed. And yet, beneath it, I sensed the same tension I carried, a shared silence neither of us dared break. Later that day, I went into the garage after they'd left. I stood among the scattered tools, the dusty shelves, the faint scent of oil and wood. I ran my fingers along the edge of the workbench and tried to remember what I used to do in this space before it was filled with so much noise. I found a pair of gardening gloves I hadn't worn in months and carried them back inside like they might root me in something familiar. That evening, while folding laundry, I found a pair of socks that weren't mine and weren't my husband's. I knew immediately whose they were. I held them in my hands for a long time, the fabric soft, slightly worn at the heels. It felt ridiculous, the way my throat tightened just holding them. I tucked them into the basket without a word. The next morning, I left the folded laundry on the bench outside the guest room, as I always did. He wasn't in the room when I passed. Or maybe he was and just didn't answer the knock. I didn't wait to find out. I began avoiding the hallway altogether. I used the back stairs when I could. I stayed busy, filled the hours with tasks that didn't need doing. The pantry had never been so organized. The linen closet looked like something out of a catalog. But no amount of structure could fix the unraveling I felt beneath my skin. My husband remained oblivious, or perhaps just unwilling to notice. He still kissed my cheek each morning. Still asked if I needed anything from the store. Still talked about the weather like it mattered. I answered each question, performed my role, wore the mask of a woman content in her routine. But every time I caught my reflection, passing by a mirror or in the window at night, I barely recognized myself. One afternoon, while I was clipping dead leaves from the hydrangeas in the front yard, I saw him through the window. He was in the kitchen, drinking from a glass, standing with his back to me. I watched him for a moment, hidden by the glare on the glass. There was something about the slope of his shoulders, the angle of his neck, that made my chest ache with a strange, unnameable grief. I turned away before he could see me. That evening, he came home later than usual. My husband asked if he'd stayed late at the library again, and he nodded. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. There was no story I was ready to hear. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The distance was becoming permanent, and I didn't know whether to mourn it or welcome it. He passed me in the hallway that night without saying a word. His shoulder brushed mine, just slightly. I froze. He didn't turn back. Just kept walking, his footsteps steady and measured, disappearing down the stairs. I stood there long after he was gone, staring at the light spilling out from under the door at the end of the hall. My fingers curled around the edge of the banister, gripping it like it might keep me upright. That night, I didn't dream. I woke several times, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs, the air in the room too thick. I went downstairs, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the kitchen sink, watching the darkness outside press against the window like it was trying to get in. I didn't know what I wanted from him anymore. I didn't even know what I wanted from myself. But I knew something had shifted again. Not back to how it was. Not forward to what it could have been. Just sideways. Off balance. Unspoken. The next morning, there was a note on the kitchen counter, written in his handwriting. Nothing dramatic. Just a reminder that he'd be out most of the day. I read it twice, folded it in half, and placed it in the drawer beneath the phone where we kept receipts and takeout menus. Later that day, I went back to the hallway. The drawer was still fixed. Smooth. Functional. It opened and closed like it was supposed to. And yet, every time I used it, I remembered the weeks when it stuck. When I had learned to live with the inconvenience. When I had convinced myself it wasn't worth the trouble to fix. Now it was different. Now it worked. But I wasn't sure I did. Not anymore. The morning he left was unusually bright. The sun poured through the kitchen windows with a kind of insistence I wasn't ready for. I stood by the sink, staring out across the yard, watching the wind move the leaves in waves. The coffee in my hand had gone cold again. I wasn't drinking much of anything lately, just holding warm cups for comfort. I didn't hear him come down the stairs until he was behind me. He paused at the kitchen doorway, his bag already slung over his shoulder. He looked like he'd been packed for hours, like leaving had been decided long before he told anyone. My husband was upstairs, still shaving, the faint buzz of the electric razor humming like static above us. "I'll be back Sunday night," he said, voice low. I nodded without turning around. "Safe drive." He didn't move right away. I heard the shift of weight in his stance, as though he was deciding whether to say something more, to leave something behind that wasn't in his duffel bag. But nothing else came. Just silence. Then the sound of the door opening and closing behind him. I remained at the window long after the sound of his car faded. I didn't cry. I didn't sigh. I just stood there, still holding the coffee, staring into a morning that felt too loud, too bright, too indifferent. It wasn't until later that afternoon that I realized what his absence left behind wasn't peace, it was exposure. With him gone, I could no longer pretend I was distracted. There was nothing to redirect the guilt, no alternate current pulling my attention sideways. It was just me and my husband, sitting across from each other again, returning to a version of our marriage that had grown dusty in the corners. He noticed the difference. Not in me, not directly. But in the air between us. He asked more questions. Watched me longer across the dinner table. Made soft jokes that didn't quite land. And I tried to laugh, tried to respond in kind, but every word I gave him felt like a performance I wasn't prepared to act out anymore. That night, we sat together on the sofa, a movie playing that neither of us had chosen with much interest. He reached for my hand midway through. I let him hold it. His fingers were warm, familiar, but I felt a tension in my own skin, like I was resisting the comfort rather than receiving it. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly, eyes still on the screen. I nodded. "Just tired." He nodded too, as if that answer satisfied something in him. Maybe he wanted to believe it as much as I wanted to offer it. Maybe that was the rhythm of long marriages, accepting soft lies in place of hard truths. The next morning, I woke before him and stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom. The face looking back at me had changed, but not in a way anyone else would notice. My features were the same, my expression composed. But I could feel it, the heaviness behind my eyes, the subtle shift in posture, the tightening at the corners of my mouth. I didn't recognize that woman, not fully. But I knew what she was hiding. I dressed with more care than usual that day. I don't know why. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was an attempt to remind myself that I still had control over how I presented myself, even if I no longer felt control over anything else. As the weekend dragged on, the house felt larger. Emptier. My husband worked on small repairs, spent hours in the garage, made calls to his sister. I cooked too much food, organized the bookshelves again, tried not to linger in the hallway. Sunday evening came quietly. The clock ticked past 7, then 8. I listened for the sound of tires on the gravel, for footsteps at the door, but none came. At 9, I checked my phone. No messages. He said he'd be back tonight, right? My husband asked casually, closing the dishwasher. I nodded. Maybe traffic. Or maybe he changed his mind. I looked up, startled. Why would he do that? He shrugged. I don't know. Things change. People change their minds. I didn't answer. I folded the dish towel slowly and placed it on the counter. We went to bed early. He fell asleep quickly. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the spaces between breaths. At some point past midnight, I heard the soft hum of a car pulling into the driveway. I didn't move. Didn't get up to look. I just listened. There was no knock. No footsteps inside. No sounds of a bag being dropped or a door opening. Just silence again. In the morning, he was in the kitchen when I came down, already dressed, already pouring coffee. He looked rested. Or maybe just resigned. I watched him from the hallway before stepping in. He glanced at me and offered a polite good morning, like nothing had happened. Did you just get in last night? I asked. He nodded. Late. Long drive? He nodded again. Yeah. That was all. No explanation. No elaboration. And I didn't push. I couldn't. The space between us had been growing too long to cross without something breaking. The days that followed were slow. We returned to a rhythm that resembled normalcy, but the silence had changed flavor. It wasn't tension anymore. It was distance. Finality. He didn't avoid me, but he no longer sought me out. We moved around each other like shadows, aware, but untouching. One evening, I stood by the living room window, watching the last light fade from the sky. My husband came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. I froze for a second before forcing myself to lean back slightly into him. I missed this, he said. I didn't ask what he meant by this. I just nodded. I couldn't tell him that I wasn't sure I knew what this was anymore. That night, as we got into bed, I noticed him watching me longer than usual. His hand reached for mine under the covers, and I let him take it. I closed my eyes and tried to quiet the noise in my chest. I tried to remember what it felt like to want to be here. I tried to make space for him in a place that still held too much of someone else. And for a moment, just a moment, I believed I could do it. But deep inside, something had changed. Something I couldn't unfeel. Something I knew would follow me, even in the quiet. The house began to feel heavier in the weeks that followed. Not from clutter or noise, but from the weight of everything unsaid. We still moved through the same spaces, sat at the same table, followed the same routines. But something had cracked, and even though no one acknowledged it, the fracture was spreading quietly beneath the surface. He was still there, present, polite, predictably distant. He no longer lingered in the kitchen or paused in the hallway. He no longer looked at me in that way. If we crossed paths, it was brief, functional, like coworkers passing in a corridor. But that avoidance held its own message. A message louder than any confrontation could have been. I found myself anticipating his absence. Not because I wanted him gone, but because his presence had become unbearable in its civility. The warmth between us had disappeared, and in its place was a kind of ghost, the memory of tension, the reminder of a mistake, the outline of something that had never been spoken aloud but could never be taken back. I began volunteering for more errands, groceries, dry cleaning, long afternoon drives to nowhere in particular. My husband noticed but didn't comment. If he suspected anything, he kept it to himself, as if by not naming it, he could keep it from being real. That was the theme of our marriage lately, endurance through omission. One Saturday morning, while wiping down the kitchen counters, I opened the drawer where we kept miscellaneous household things, batteries, pens, notepads, coupons, and saw the note he'd written weeks ago. The one he'd left before his weekend away. I had tucked it in there without thinking at the time, unsure if I meant to keep it or forget it. But now, seeing his handwriting again, I felt a jolt of something I didn't expect. Not pain. Not desire. Just recognition. Like reading a letter addressed to someone I no longer was. I closed the drawer quietly and continued cleaning. By the time I finished, I had reorganized every shelf and wiped down the baseboards. It didn't make me feel better. It just gave my hands something to do while my mind unraveled. That evening, my husband suggested we go out to dinner. We hadn't been anywhere in months, not just the two of us. I hesitated for a moment, then agreed. I wore a dress I hadn't worn since last summer, touched up my makeup, and when I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror before leaving, I realized I looked almost like the version of myself he still believed in. The restaurant was warm and loud, filled with the clatter of cutlery and casual conversation. We sat near the window. He ordered wine. I smiled at the server, placed my order, nodded when he spoke. We talked about the usual things, his work, our son's last call, the neighbor's new dog. But beneath it all, I sensed he was testing the waters, watching for signs that something in me had shifted too far to reach. "You've been quiet lately," he said, after our meals were cleared away. "I've had a lot on my mind," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He didn't press. He just looked at me for a long moment and nodded slowly, as if that was enough. Or maybe he was choosing to let it be enough. On the drive home, I stared out the window, watching the lights blur into soft orbs in the dark. I tried to imagine what it would feel like to confess everything. To hand him the truth and watch it dismantle the quiet we'd managed to rebuild. But the truth didn't feel like relief. It felt like destruction. And I wasn't sure either of us had the strength for that kind of honesty. When we got home, he kissed me at the door. I kissed him back. It was gentle, familiar, a gesture of habit more than passion. But something in me softened, just briefly, under the weight of it. He went upstairs first, calling out that he would get the bedroom ready. I lingered in the hallway, removing my earrings slowly, my fingers cold against my skin. He had left a jacket draped over the back of the sofa. I reached for it to hang it properly, and as I did, I caught sight of a folded paper poking out from the inside pocket. I shouldn't have touched it. I knew that. But my hand moved before I could stop it. It was a receipt from a hardware store, dated earlier that week. Underneath it, a smaller paper, a list in his handwriting. Not items for the house. Just words: talk. Ask. Decide. Let go. I stood there, holding the paper, my breath stuck somewhere between inhale and collapse. I folded it back up, placed it exactly where I found it, and walked upstairs as if nothing had happened. That night, as we lay side by side, I stared at the ceiling while his breathing evened out beside me. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just listened to the silence between us, stretching wider with every breath. In the morning, he was gone before I woke. A note on the kitchen table said he'd gone to the hardware store and would be back before lunch. His handwriting looked rushed, the letters slightly uneven. The young man was in the backyard when I looked out the window. Kneeling near the flower bed, gloves on, sleeves rolled up. I hadn't seen him there in days. I watched him from behind the curtain, something tightening in my chest. Not longing. Not anger. Just weariness. I didn't go out to him. I stayed inside and made coffee. I stood by the sink and stared at the backyard while it brewed, and for the first time in weeks, I let my shoulders drop. Let the breath out slowly. Let the silence sit beside me like an old friend instead of a threat. The drawer in the hallway was still working perfectly. I passed it twice that day and didn't open it. I didn't need to. Because some things, once broken, might get repaired. But they never go back to being what they were. And sometimes, even when they do work again, you still flinch when you pull the handle. You still remember how long they didn't. The days slipped into each other like pages in a worn book, familiar, a little frayed around the edges, but still legible. I moved through them with the quiet efficiency I'd perfected over the years. Mornings came with coffee and the low murmur of news on the television. Afternoons were filled with errands, lists, the dull rhythms of habit. Evenings, with dinners eaten more for routine than hunger. He and I had settled into something that resembled neutrality. If there had once been a spark, it had cooled into ash, still warm, still holding memory, but no longer alive. He was cordial, helpful when asked, distant in every way that counted. We exchanged pleasantries and occasional smiles, but nothing more. The silence between us had become structured, like a mutual agreement neither of us dared disturb. I told myself I was grateful for that. That distance made everything easier. But easier didn't mean lighter. The weight of what had happened, of what we had allowed to happen, hadn't disappeared. It had simply redistributed itself into the spaces we used to fill with something else. The laughter in the kitchen. The lingering glances in hallways. The questions we once asked without needing answers. Now, we said less. We said safer things. One afternoon, as I was pruning the hydrangeas near the front porch, I heard the front door open behind me. I didn't turn right away. The scissors in my hand clicked rhythmically through a dry stem. "You missed a spot," came his voice, low and even. I turned halfway, squinting against the sun. "Did I?" He pointed to a spot I'd already seen but intentionally left untouched, a bloom not quite dead, not quite alive. "I was leaving that one," I said quietly. We stood in silence for a few moments. Then he nodded, gave a small wave, and walked to his car. I didn't watch him leave. I stared at the bloom instead, its edges curled, center still soft. I clipped it anyway. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my husband, sorting through a box of old mail and receipts. He was talking about repainting the fence before the weather turned. I nodded along, giving him my attention, or at least the appearance of it. But part of me drifted back to that moment in the garden. To the silence. To the unspoken understanding. "Are you even listening?" my husband asked, more amused than irritated. I blinked. "Sorry. Long day." He gave me a knowing smile. "You've had a lot of those lately." I smiled back. It was the kind of smile built for surviving. That night, I dreamt of the lake house. Not of what had happened there, not of him. Just the silence. The way the air had felt before everything changed. The stillness before motion. When I woke, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of traffic outside, the steady hum of the fan. For once, I didn't feel guilt. Just the hollow echo of something I could no longer name. The next morning, I found him in the garage, organizing the shelves. It was early, earlier than he usually started his day. He was wiping down a box of old tools, his movements mechanical. I stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to do all this." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "It needed to be done." I stepped inside, the concrete cool under my bare feet. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" He paused, then nodded. "Probably next week. Got a place lined up closer to campus." I waited for a feeling to follow that. Sadness. Relief. Regret. But there was only quiet. "That's good," I said. "It'll be easier for you." He nodded again. "It's time." I picked up a rag and wiped off a dusty screwdriver, unsure why. My fingers moved on their own, like the motion might anchor me to something real. We worked like that for a while. Side by side. Silently. Until I placed the rag down and turned to him. "I never wanted it to happen." "I know," he said. I waited for him to say more. He didn't. I didn't press. When I left the garage, I didn't look back. And when I returned to the house, I stood at the hallway drawer and opened it slowly. It glided out without resistance. I stared at its contents, nothing important. Spare batteries. A few screws. A receipt for lawn service I'd forgotten to file. I closed it carefully and stepped away. That weekend, my husband planned a dinner with a couple from his office. We hadn't entertained in a while, and he seemed excited. I cleaned the house thoroughly, set the table with care, lit the tall candles we reserved for occasions that didn't come often anymore. He complimented the meal. They laughed at his stories. I smiled in the right places. I poured the wine. I kept the conversation moving. No one suspected that anything had ever fallen out of place. When they left, my husband kissed the top of my head. "You were amazing tonight," he said. I nodded and began clearing the dishes. Upstairs, later that night, I stood by the window and looked out over the backyard. The flower beds were neat. The lights on the patio glowed softly. I thought about how much I'd wanted to preserve this life. How hard I'd worked to keep it intact, even as something inside me had cracked. I turned away from the window, moved to the mirror, and studied my reflection. My hair was pinned, my makeup faded but even. My face looked calm. Familiar. But I felt like a woman who had lived too many lives in too short a time. A woman who had loved, and failed, and tried again to be whole. I didn't know what was next. I didn't know how much more pretending I had in me. But I knew this, the silence between us, between me and him, had given way to a deeper quiet. One that no longer throbbed with tension, but settled into acceptance. Some chapters don't end with punctuation. They end with space. And I was beginning to make peace with the blank page. The last week before he moved out unfolded with a kind of deliberate slowness, as if time itself was trying to make room for a final inventory of the life we'd all inhabited together. Each day, I was aware of the little rituals ending, the extra mug by the sink in the morning, the shuffle of 2 sets of footsteps in the hallway, the familiar click of his door closing at night. I felt a strange sense of mourning, even as I told myself this was what I'd wanted, what needed to happen for everything to find its own order again. He packed quietly, boxing up his textbooks and mismatched mugs, gathering sweatshirts from the laundry room and shoes from under the bench by the door. I watched from a distance, offering to help only once, and when he declined, I didn't insist. There was no need for one last conversation, no requirement for closure, just a series of practical tasks carried out with steady hands. My husband was gentle in his farewells, offering advice, reminding him about road conditions near campus, even tucking a 20 into his palm with a paternal pat on the back. I stood by the window and watched them load the car, feeling the weight of words I wouldn't say gathering in my throat. As they shook hands one last time, I realized how much had been risked in the shadows of these rooms, and how much would be left behind, unspoken. When he finally came to say goodbye, he lingered in the doorway of the living room, eyes searching mine for something neither of us could give. There was no animosity, no blame. Just a quiet sadness, a mutual understanding that some lines, once crossed, cannot be redrawn. I managed a small smile, the kind that carries gratitude and apology at once. He nodded, holding my gaze for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable, then turned and left. The door closed softly behind him, its click echoing down the hallway, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I was still learning how to read. For a long time after, I stood in the center of the living room, staring at the sunlight that crept in through the window and lay in golden stripes across the rug. The house felt bigger somehow, emptier, but not in a way that demanded filling. It was the emptiness of a finished chapter, a pause, not a void. My husband returned, his face relaxed, unaware of the true cost of the quiet that had settled over our home. He asked if I wanted to take a walk, and I agreed. We strolled through the neighborhood, the familiar streets lit by the slant of late afternoon sun. We talked about the neighbors' gardens, the changing weather, our plans for the fall. The conversation was gentle, even easy. If he noticed how often I drifted into silence, he didn't mention it. That evening, after dinner, I found myself drawn to the hallway where the troublesome drawer had lived its double life, first as a source of frustration, then as an unlikely confidant, and now as just another piece of furniture. I pulled it open and closed, feeling the smoothness of its motion, remembering the many times I'd tolerated its stubbornness. Funny, I thought, how you can grow attached to something broken, convinced it's not worth the effort to fix, until suddenly, one day, you do, and then must learn to live with the difference. I sat in the quiet, folding laundry as the sun disappeared and the house took on its gentle twilight hush. I thought about everything that had passed between us, the spark and ache of being seen, the loneliness that pressed in from all sides, the choice to reach for something that could never last. I wondered if he would remember any of it, or if the memory would fade into the ordinary, lost among other mistakes and small moments of beauty. Night came, and with it the familiar rituals, doors locking, lights dimming, the sound of my husband's voice calling out that he was heading to bed. I paused in the kitchen, turning off the last light, letting my fingers linger on the countertop. The house was still, as if waiting for me to decide what story would fill the silence next. Upstairs, I watched my husband sleep for a while, his breathing slow and even. I thought about the life we'd built, layer upon layer, year after year, how it had survived so much, how it could survive even this. I lay down beside him, letting the quiet wrap around me, not as a punishment, but as a space to think, to breathe, to forgive. In the end, nothing was truly mended, but nothing had completely broken either. Life continued, not unchanged, but undeniably altered, its shape defined by the lines I'd crossed and the ones I'd chosen, at last, to respect. As I closed my eyes, I found comfort not in answers, but in the questions I could finally admit were mine to live with. The drawer, the house, the story, all still here, all still mine. And in that quiet, I let myself rest.